There are families so powerful that an entire city lowers its voice when their name is spoken. Yet the one thing they can never buy is someone willing to sit beside their bed when they are dying. Antonia Barone was 71 years old, mistress of the largest Greystone estate on the east side of Providence. A woman no one had dared interrupt in 30 years. And yet that winter, a doctor sat down across from her and told her that her heart did not have much time left. She was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of dying and leaving her only son, a man the whole city called Mr. Barone. A man no one dared look straight in the eye, to live out the rest of his life in a house where not a single person loved him honestly. So she built herself a game. For 18 months, every woman who walked into that room at the end of the west corridor was tested not with money, but with an old woman sitting in the dark, pretending to be confused, calling them by the name of a daughter who had been gone for years. 11 women came. Not one of them stayed longer than 4 minutes. Then came a January night, when a snowstorm took out the power to the entire West Wing. And the person who pushed that door open was not a candidate at all. She was the maid who had been working there for exactly 9 days. The one who had been forbidden to set foot in that corridor in the first place. What she did in the 4 minutes that followed made the most powerful woman in Providence rewrite her final wishes entirely. And what no one in that house knew, not even her son, was that the girl had not walked into the wrong room at all. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists in this world. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories still waiting ahead. 9 days before that blizzard night, about 4 miles south of the east side, in a 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, 9-year-old Wesley Hollis was lying on his stomach in the middle of the kitchen floor, with sheets of paper spread from the foot of the refrigerator all the way to the doorway. He was drawing a fire truck, and because the fire truck in his imagination was longer than the paper, he had taped another sheet beside it, then decided that still wasn't enough, and added a third. The truck was now twice as long as the original sheet, with a ladder, a hose, 6 wheels, and a dog sitting in the front seat, because, according to Wesley, it was a firehouse dog, and therefore deserved to ride up front. Marin stepped into the kitchen, nearly brought her foot down on the back end of the truck, and Wesley cried out for her to go around, because that part wasn't dry yet. She went around, she poured herself some coffee, leaned against the sink, and watched her little brother crawl from one end of the drawing to the other on his elbows. Then he looked up and said the thing he'd been waiting all morning to tell her. He said he'd chosen the color. Marin asked what color. He said red. He said they'd told him the crutches after his surgery could be blue, black, or red. And he'd chosen red like a fire truck. Then he laughed loudly, the bright, bursting laugh of a child who had just discovered an idea too wonderful for his own imagination, and added that when the time came, he was going to draw a siren on the crutches too. Marin told him that was a good idea. There was a knock at the door, and Odessa Pike from the apartment next door poked her head inside, holding a tin of cookies fresh from the oven, and said she'd pick Wesley up from school as usual, and if Marin came home late, the boy could have dinner at her place. She looked down at the kitchen floor, gave a low whistle of admiration at the drawing, and Wesley immediately began explaining why the dog was allowed to sit in the front seat. Marin slipped on her coat, passed behind him, bent down to kiss his hair, reminded him to finish all the bread in the cupboard, then went out the door. When she reached the parking lot, she got into her old car and didn't start the engine right away. On the seat beside her were 3 envelopes she'd taken from the mailbox the day before and still hadn't opened. She opened the first. It was a letter from the orthopedic hospital informing her that surgery for patient Wesley Hollis had been scheduled for the spring, and in the notes section, the doctor had written in neat typed letters that every one of the child's indicators was favorable, that his age made this the best time for intervention, and that the prognosis for recovery after surgery was very promising. On the final line, printed in bold, there was one more sentence. Please confirm insurance coverage no later than 30 days before the date of surgery. Marin read that sentence twice. She opened the second envelope. It was a demand letter from a collection agency in Warwick for a total of $40,000, and on the back was a table listing the interest charged each month. She didn't need to read the table. She knew exactly where the number had come from. 6 years earlier, when she was 21 and her mother had begun her second round of treatment, her father had sat down at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and told her the bank needed one more person to sign with him, that it was only a formality. She had taken the pen and signed. No one had forced her. She had read every page before putting her name on it, had understood what being a joint guarantor meant, and she had signed anyway, because there was a stack of papers on the table and a woman in the next room who needed medicine. Her mother died 14 months later. Her father left the city 4 months after the funeral, and they stopped pursuing him because they couldn't find him, so they came after her instead. She folded the letter and opened the third envelope. It was from the State Board of Nursing, 2 paragraphs written from a standard form. The first confirmed that her petition for reconsideration had been received. The second informed her that the suspension of her nursing license remained in effect, that no review date had been scheduled, and that she would be notified when anything changed. Not a single word said when. She sat motionless in the car for a while with the 3 papers resting on her lap. Outside, the season's first snow had formed a thin layer across the windshield. Then she folded all 3, placed them in the glove compartment, and took out a job notice that had been folded into quarters several days earlier. Full-time cleaning staff wanted for a private residence on the east side. Must be hard-working, discreet, and willing to work evening shifts. The pay was listed clearly, and the figure was twice what any other place had offered her during the past 3 months. On the final line, printed in smaller type than the rest, it stated that permanent employees received health insurance covering dependents as well, effective after 90 days of employment. Marin had read that line 4 times in 4 days. She had also spent 2 evenings looking up the address printed on the notice, reading old newspaper articles, short reports that never named anyone directly, and the half-whispered speculation people left in the comments below. She knew exactly whose house it was. She sat for another moment in the cold car, looking up at the 3rd-floor window where the light was still on, where a little boy was stretched out across the kitchen floor, explaining to the neighbor why the firehouse dog was allowed to ride in the front seat. Then she took out her phone and dialed the number printed on the paper. Marin Hollis's first morning at the Barone estate began at 6:15 in the secondary kitchen beneath the basement level, where Fern Whitlock placed a typed sheet of paper in front of her and told her to read every line aloud. The 60-year-old housekeeper neither smiled nor spoke harshly. She merely wore the weary expression of someone who had read that list too many times to too many people before watching them leave. Don't look directly into a guest's face. Don't ask the name of anyone who comes through the front door. Don't accept anything from anyone's hand, whether it's a tip, a glass of water, or something they insist that you take. Don't bring a phone to the 2nd floor. Don't answer when someone inside the house calls your name unless you can see their face. And the final rule, which Mrs. Whitlock read far more slowly than the others, was that under no circumstances was she to set foot in the west corridor, even if someone inside called out to her. Marin finished reading, folded the paper, and asked a question she would remember for years afterward, because it was the first and last question she dared to ask during her first 9 days. She asked what room stood at the end of that corridor. Mrs. Whitlock didn't look up. She wiped her hands on a towel, slipped the paper into a file folder, and answered in exactly 9 words, so clipped and final that it sounded like a door closing. An elderly relative. It's none of your concern. Then she added one more sentence, her voice softer but colder, saying that in this house, people were paid for their hands, not their curiosity, and those who forgot that rarely remained longer than a week. Marin nodded. She was accustomed to not asking questions. Over the past 2 years, she had learned that every question carried a price, and she had nothing left with which to pay. That day, she cleaned 32 oak steps, polished the brass banister, replaced the towels in 4 guest bathrooms, and didn't speak more than 3 sentences to anyone. Near noon, while she was kneeling to wipe the baseboards in the 1st-floor hallway, a man in a wool overcoat entered the formal dining room, and the door closed behind him. Marin hadn't meant to listen, but the wooden door was thick without being sealed, and she was directly outside it. The man spoke at great length. He talked about missing money, a delayed shipment, and numbers that didn't balance because of a mistake made by someone who had left the month before. He spoke for nearly 4 minutes, his voice rising higher and growing more hurried with every sentence. The voice of a man who knew perfectly well that he was lying, and was trying to speak so quickly that no one would have time to interrupt him. No one did. There wasn't a single interruption. No fist struck the table. When the man finally stopped to breathe, the room remained silent for roughly 3 seconds, and then Marin heard a low male voice, steady and unhurried, speak exactly 4 words. "You have 3 days," that was all. No threat, no curse, no detail anyone could seize upon and repeat later. The door opened, and the man in the wool coat stepped out, his face drained white. He passed Marin where she was kneeling without seeing her at all, as though there was no room left in his mind for anyone but himself. The door closed behind him. That afternoon, while Marin carried a tray of clean towels across the main hall, she saw the entire line of servants move aside and bow their heads at once. She followed them, half a beat too late. Footsteps crossed the stone floor, neither hurried nor slow, and through her lowered gaze, she saw the hem of a dark coat pass through her field of vision. Rocco Barone didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. Only after the footsteps had faded did the heads begin to rise one by one. And no one said a word about what had just happened, as though one man walking through a hall was perfectly ordinary, and 13 people bowing their heads together was perfectly ordinary too. That evening, sitting in her car in the servants' parking area, Marin opened her phone and looked at her own search history from 3 weeks earlier. Barone, Providence, East Side, old newspaper articles, brief reports that named no one directly, and half-formed comments people had left beneath them. She had read every word. She had known exactly what house she was entering before she dialed the number. She hadn't been deceived, persuaded, or led there by accident. She had sat in this very car, reading every line, then turned off her phone, then made the call. Because the advertisement contained a line in small print stating that health insurance would cover dependents after 90 days of employment, and because spring was coming quickly, and she had already knocked on every other door in the city. People often believed that the poor walked knowingly into dangerous places because they didn't understand the danger. The truth was usually the opposite. They knew. They knew very well. But when a person had only one door left before them, they no longer stopped to ask where that door might lead. They asked only whether it would open. At the far end of the house, beyond the door Marin Hollis had just been warned never to cross, Antonia Barone sat beside the window with a leather-bound notebook open on her lap, drew a line through the final entry, and closed it. She remained still for a long while, one hand resting on the leather cover worn soft from being opened and shut too many times, her eyes fixed on the white courtyard below. Then she placed the notebook in the bottom drawer, locked it, and slipped the key into the pocket of her robe as she always did. When Mrs. Whitlock knocked and brought up the afternoon medication tray, Antonia had risen to open the door herself, and she had crossed the distance from the window to the bedroom door, some 20 steps, before she had to grasp the back of a chair and lower herself into it, letting out a long breath and smiling as though she had just accomplished something of consequence. The wheelchair remained untouched in the corner beneath a cloth, and Antonia used it only when she had to travel the full length of the corridor or go downstairs, and even one such journey a week was considered more than enough. Mrs. Whitlock set down the tray, counted the pills, made a note on the medication chart, and said nothing. Antonia spoke first. She asked whether the housekeeper remembered the winter when she had moved into this house. Mrs. Whitlock said she did, because she had been the one to lay the first rug in the formal dining room that year. Antonia nodded, then continued in the calm voice of someone recounting a truth everyone in the house already knew, but no one had ever dared to speak aloud, saying that the gray stone mansion had been part of her family dowry, that her father had bought it when she was 19, and that throughout the 40 years that followed, it had never once been registered in her husband's name. Mrs. Whitlock gave only a quiet murmur of acknowledgement. Antonia said the entire family knew it, and that was precisely why, after all those years of holding their meetings in her dining room and eating at her table, they still carried the sour expression of people living in someone else's home. Then she asked Mrs. Whitlock to bring her the blue file from the cabinet, and when the housekeeper handed it to her, Antonia opened it, turned to the final page, and pointed to the signature line dated 2019. That will left the entire house to Delphine, her younger sister. Antonia said she had signed it during the year when she believed she would die before she could find a better reason not to. Mrs. Whitlock asked whether she intended to change it. Antonia closed the file and said not yet, that the time hadn't come, and that certain things could only be changed once, so a person had to wait until she was certain. Late that afternoon, Rocco came upstairs. He didn't knock. He had never knocked on his mother's door, but he always paused for 3 seconds at the threshold before entering, a habit he had carried since he was 19 and no longer noticed in himself. Antonia asked whether he had eaten. He said he had. She told him he was lying. He didn't argue. She asked about the man in the wool coat from earlier that day, and he replied that the matter was finished. Antonia studied her son for a moment, then asked the question she had asked once every month for the past 2 years, whether he intended to marry, whether he planned to allow one more person into that house. Rocco rose and walked toward the window, answering without turning around. He said he didn't need a wife. He needed someone who wouldn't betray him. And those two things had never been the same. Antonia remained silent long enough for the words to cool in the room. Then she said he had spoken exactly like his father, word for word, and that he knew very well how his father's life had ended. Rocco didn't answer. She went on, her voice still even, saying that man had also believed he needed loyalty rather than love, and in the end he had an entire city bowing its head to him. Yet when the final moment came, she was the only person left in the room. Rocco turned around, and for one brief instant, the expression he had worn for 15 years cracked along a fine, invisible line, then sealed itself again. He said she should rest. Antonia said she would rest when her work was finished. He asked what work. She didn't answer. He remained there a little longer, then bent to kiss his mother's hair, an awkward gesture from a man unaccustomed to tenderness, and left. When the sound of his footsteps had completely faded down the corridor, Antonia summoned Mrs. Whitlock. She told the housekeeper to prepare the small sitting room on the first floor, replace the flowers, and arrange tea for 2 the following afternoon. Mrs. Whitlock asked whether a guest was coming. Antonia looked out the window, where the snow had begun falling again since late afternoon, and said yes. Someone would come tomorrow, and this time she hoped they would arrive on time. The guest didn't arrive the following afternoon, because by noon, the snow had grown so heavy that the city closed 3 major roads leading into the east side, and by 7 o'clock that evening, the entire west wing of the house lost power. Maren Hollis was working the late afternoon shift that day, the shift no one wanted because it stretched nearly to midnight, and she had accepted it on her second day of work because it came with extra pay. When the lights went out, the entire house fell into darkness for about 3 seconds before the backup system in the main section switched on by itself, but nothing in the west wing came back to life. Mrs. Whitlock summoned every member of the household staff to the great hall and assigned them one by one, who would carry candles, who would watch the fireplaces, who would call the electric company, and who would go upstairs to check the guest rooms that were occupied. In the middle of it all, the heating system alarm began sounding in the kitchen area. Then the generator in the storage building ran for half a minute before shutting down, and Mrs. Whitlock, with 3 people speaking into her ears at once, turned and pointed at Maren because she was standing closest to the stairs leading down to the basement. She told her to go down and close backup breaker number 2, the one on the left row, and warned her not to touch anything else. Maren took a flashlight and went downstairs. The basement was cold and carried the damp smell of old stone, and it took her about 7 minutes to find the correct row, read the correct label, and pull the correct switch. Above her came the faint hum of electricity returning, then the pounding of feet running across the floor overhead, then someone's distant cheer. She remained in the darkness a little longer to make sure the breaker didn't trip again, then started back upstairs. The basement staircase led to a service corridor, and that corridor opened directly onto this end of the west hallway. Maren knew that. She had passed this place every day for 9 days, and every day she had continued straight ahead without turning, without stopping, without looking toward the far end of the hall where a dark wooden door always remained closed. But that night, just as she stepped onto the final stair, she heard a bell. It was very faint. It wasn't the doorbell, it wasn't a fire alarm, and it wasn't any bell she had ever heard inside this house. It was a thin metallic sound, brief and trembling, rising once before dying away, and Maren recognized it immediately because she had heard it for 4 years in hospital corridors. The bell placed beside a patient's bed so they could call when they needed someone, anyone at all. She stopped in the dark hallway, still holding the flashlight, and waited. Somewhere behind her, at the far end of the house, voices echoed faintly. Mrs. Whitlock snapping at someone, footsteps running over the stone floor. No one was coming this way. No one had heard anything. The bell rang a second time. Maren stood there, and in her mind, swift and painfully clear, appeared every reason that had brought her into this house. 90 days. She had completed only 9. 81 days remained before the insurance card would take effect for her dependent, and the only dependent listed in her file was a 9-year-old boy who had already chosen red for his crutches. The surgery was scheduled for spring. Spring was still months away, but those months existed only if she managed to keep this job. She thought of the typed sheet Mrs. Whitlock had forced her to read aloud in the secondary kitchen of the final rule written there, of the 9 words the housekeeper had spoken when Marin asked her question. She thought that all it would take was one person seeing her standing here, not even doing anything, merely standing here, and by morning she would be paid for 9 days and told to leave. And she thought of one more thing, something she hadn't allowed herself to think about for 2 years, that there had been a night 2 years earlier when she had stood outside a door just like this one, had calculated the same way, had told herself there were too many other things to do, that she could come back in a little while, and by the time she returned, everything was already over. The bell rang a 3rd time. Marin Hollis walked toward the end of the hallway. She didn't run. She walked, 1 step at a time, fully conscious, fully aware of what she was doing and what it would cost her. That was the most important truth about that night, the one no one in the house would later be willing to believe, that the young woman hadn't wandered there by mistake, hadn't arrived there by accident, hadn't misunderstood the rules. She knew. She remembered every word. And she went anyway. People often imagined that kindness was impulsive, something that leaped from us before thought could catch up. But the most costly kindness in this world was always the kind that contained complete understanding. The kind shown when a person had counted every part of the price, had understood exactly what they were about to lose, and still stepped forward. She placed her hand on the doorknob. The door wasn't locked. She pushed it open, and the beam of her flashlight swept across the dark room, passing over the side of the bed, the edge of a table, a fallen picture frame, then stopped. In the middle of the room, seated motionless in a wheelchair facing the window, was an elderly woman. Marin didn't call for anyone. She took 2 steps forward and lowered the flashlight so the beam wouldn't shine directly into the woman's face, and the first thing her hand touched wasn't the elderly woman herself, but the length of clear tubing draped across the arm of the wheelchair. It had folded in on itself, bent into a sharp angle where it had caught against the armrest, and Marin freed it, smoothed it straight, then raised the end to her cheek to feel the cool flow of air passing through before placing it back where it belonged. Then her fingers found the woman's wrist, pressed gently over the pulse point, and she looked at her watch. She counted. She didn't think while she counted, didn't calculate anything, didn't feel afraid, because the part of her that was doing this was the part that had been suspended, crossed off, and sealed away inside a letter from the state board, and yet it rose before conscious thought, like something no one could ever truly take from her. The pulse was steady. She placed a hand against the woman's chest, counted her breaths for a full 15 seconds, multiplied the number in her head, and found it within the acceptable range. No bluish skin, no labored pulling at the ribs. The woman wasn't unconscious. She was only sleeping fitfully in a cold room, and the cold was the real problem. Marin lowered the beam toward the floor and saw a blanket lying there, one corner still caught over the wheel, and when she picked it up, she found that water from the overturned glass beside it had soaked through nearly half of it. She crossed to the linen cabinet at the far end of the room, locked. She knew the key was on Mrs. Whitlock's ring, and Mrs. Whitlock was now at the other end of the house among more than a dozen people, and 3 emergencies unfolding at once, while the entire West Wing remained without power. Marin stood there for about 2 seconds. Then she set the flashlight on the table, turned it upward so the light spread across the ceiling, and took off her sweater. It was the only sweater she had that winter, gray and faded at the elbows, and she laid it out, folded it in half, placed it across the elderly woman's knees, then tucked the edges down carefully on both sides to hold in the warmth. A framed photograph lay face down on the table. Marin stood it upright, wiped the glass with the sleeve of her shirt, and in the brief sweep of light, she caught sight of a young couple standing before a set of stone steps, the woman in the photograph laughing as she held the brim of her hat against the wind. Marin returned the frame to its proper place and turned it so the photograph faced the bed. Then she picked up the flashlight and walked toward the door. Her hand was already on the knob. She had opened the door a crack, and she stopped. She stood there with her back to the room, for no one knew how long, and no one would ever know what passed through her mind in that moment, because even she couldn't explain it afterward. She simply closed the door again, walked back into the room, and sat down on the floor beside the wheelchair. The cold stone seeped through the thin fabric of her clothes. She found the woman's hand resting loosely on the armrest, a thin hand with fragile skin, cold as though it had just been holding snow, and Marin took it between both of hers and held it there, She didn't clean anything. She didn't arrange anything. She did nothing at all. She only sat. After a while, the elderly woman stirred. Her eyes remained closed. Her breathing changed. And she spoke a name. She whispered it very softly, twice, the name of a young woman, and her fingers closed around Marin's hand with what little strength remained in them. Marin didn't correct her. She understood perfectly well that it wasn't her name, and she understood what lay behind it, that whoever the woman was calling for had surely been gone from that room for a very long time. Marin said nothing. She only tightened her hold a little, and she stayed. When the woman's breathing settled into an even rhythm again, Marin slowly eased her hand free and placed the fragile hand in the warmest place she could find. Beneath the edge of her own sweater, she rose. "Before leaving," she said, so quietly that even she wasn't certain the words had made it into the air, that no one deserved to be left sitting alone in the dark. Then she stepped out, closed the door exactly as she had found it, and walked back down the hallway in her thin shirt, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, trembling with cold, so she could finish the work still waiting from the late shift. Inside the room, when the sound of her footsteps had completely faded, Antonia Barone opened her eyes. She remained still for a long time, staring up at the ceiling. Then she looked down and saw a gray sweater, faded at the elbows, folded carefully in half across her knees with its edges tucked along both sides. She reached out and touched it. Then the woman whom no one had dared interrupt in 30 years began to cry. For the first time in 20 years, alone in the darkness, seated in a wheelchair facing the window. There was one thing the young woman didn't know, that the 4 minutes she had just spent there were the longest 4 minutes anyone had ever remained in that room. And there was one thing the elderly woman didn't know either. Marin hadn't done it out of kindness toward someone wealthy. She had done it because she had once seen another woman lying that way, in another room, on another night, and that night, she had arrived too late. By dawn the following morning, the electricity had returned, and the snow had stopped falling, and Rocco Barone came to his mother's room shortly before 9 o'clock, with a cup of coffee in his hand, as he did every morning. Antonia was seated in the chair by the window, and resting on her lap, folded neatly into a small square, was the gray sweater faded at the elbows. She told him what had happened from the beginning, using the same calm voice she used when speaking about the electric bill or the weather. She told him that someone had rung the bell 3 times, and no one had answered. She told him that someone had entered, straightened the oxygen tubing, checked her pulse, and counted her breathing. And she repeated that detail twice, because she knew what it meant. She told him about the wet blanket, the locked linen cabinet, and the sweater that had been taken off. She told him that someone had set the fallen photograph upright on the table and turned it toward the bed. Then she reached the final part, the part where someone had made it all the way to the door before turning back and sitting down on the floor, and there she stopped. She didn't tell him the rest. Rocco set down his coffee. He asked whether she was certain. Antonia said she was. He asked again, more slowly this time, whether she was sure she hadn't dreamed it, mistaken the woman for the night nurse, or confused the previous evening with some other night. Antonia looked at her son. She said her heart was failing, not her mind, and that if he wanted proof, he could ask Mrs. Whitlock, who had gone down to the basement to close the breaker the night before. Rocco remained silent for a moment, then said the thing he had been thinking since the 3rd sentence of her story. He said no one was kind without a reason in this house. He said that in 15 years, he hadn't encountered a single exception, not one, and that everything resembling kindness beneath this roof was merely an investment with a maturity date, the only difference being whether people came to collect sooner or later. He said a maid who had worked there for only 9 days had no reason to take off her own sweater and place it over an elderly woman whose identity she supposedly didn't even know, unless she knew very well who that woman was. Antonia asked what he thought the young woman wanted. Rocco said he didn't know yet, and that was precisely what troubled him. Antonia said she had been testing people for 18 months, that she had counted every minute, and no one had ever stayed longer than 4 minutes, not one person, including those who had every reason in the world to remain much longer. Rocco said exactly, and that was why someone had learned precisely how long she needed to stay. The sentence fell between mother and son and remained there. Antonia studied him for a long time. Then, without raising her voice, she said there was something she wanted him to hear clearly. She said he owned 8 companies, had 4 different names listed on 4 insurance contracts, and there were men in that city who woke every morning with one thought before all others: that they must do nothing that day to make Rocco remember them. She said she loved him, that she had loved him before he knew how to walk, and that she would love him until her final breath. Then she spoke the last sentence very slowly. "But I've never met anyone poorer than you." Rocco rose and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and in the silence, something returned that he had spent 15 years forcing from his mind. That evening, Antonia had been cooking dinner. She remembered exactly what her hands were doing when the telephone rang, and she remembered wiping them on her apron before picking up the receiver, because she was the kind of woman who always wiped her hands before answering the telephone. She listened. She didn't say a word. Then she put the receiver down, returned to the stove, and turned off the flame. That was all. In her memory, there was nothing else but her hand resting on the knob and the sound of the flame dying. No one touched the food in the pot that evening, and throughout the remaining 40 years of her life, Antonia Barone never cooked that dish again. 3 weeks after the funeral, 19-year-old Rocco sat before his mother in this very room and told her he would take his father's place. Not because he wanted it, but because if he didn't take hold of it, someone else would, and that person would come for her. Antonia had begged him not to do it. She had cried, something she had never done in front of her son before and would never do again afterward. In the end, she asked him to promise only one thing, that the work wouldn't take away the person he was. He had promised. He had truly believed he meant it, and throughout the 15 years that followed, he hadn't kept that promise for a single day. Rocco turned around. The expression he wore every day had returned, whole and unbroken. He said she should rest, that Dr. Halloran had warned her not to become distressed. Antonia said she wasn't distressed. She was only speaking to her son. He bent down, kissed her hair, and walked out. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around and asked what the woman's name was. Antonia said she hadn't asked. Rocco gave a single nod and stepped into the hallway. And she knew perfectly well that before noon that day, her son would know the young woman's name, her date of birth, where she lived, and even the things the young woman herself had probably forgotten she had once disclosed somewhere. Before 11 o'clock that morning, the employment file was lying on Rocco Barone's desk, and he read it the way he read everything, twice. The first time to learn what it contained, the second to discover what it didn't. Marin Hollis, 27 years old, born in Woonsocket, studied nursing for 3.5 years at a community college before leaving, worked for 4 years as a contract nurse at St. Brendan Hospital, and left that job 2 years earlier. Her current address was a 2-room apartment on the south side of the city. No unpaid taxes, no criminal record. A consumer debt of $40,000 jointly held with a man named Lawrence Hollis, sold to a collection agency 2 years earlier. 3 job applications rejected by 3 different employers in the same month, and the 4th application had been submitted here. Everything fit. Everything was exactly as it should be for a woman who had reached the end of every other road. Rocco reached the 9th page and stopped. In the expanded background report, beneath administrative notes, there was a single line about an internal investigation at St. Brendan involving missing prescription medication, which had ended with termination of employment and suspension of her nursing license, without prosecution. 1 line. That 1 line alone should have been enough to send any application into the rejection pile in this house. And Rocco knew it, because he was the one who had established that rule 10 years earlier, after an incident he never spoke about. Yet she had been hired. He turned back through the pages. Clipped behind the application on the 2nd page was a typed letter of recommendation on the letterhead of a private clinic in Pawtucket, brief, restrained, and formal, stating that the bearer was a devoted and trustworthy employee, that the information in her former record didn't reflect the person she truly was, and asking that the receiving party consider her as a human being ought to be considered. It was signed by a doctor named Robert Ainsley. Rocco made 1 phone call, then he made a second. By early afternoon, he had answers to both. The clinic had existed, but it had closed 3 years earlier, and throughout its entire employment history, no one named Robert Ainsley had ever worked there. The state medical board had never licensed a physician by that name either. The person who had signed the letter didn't exist. Rocco sat for a long time with the paper in his hand. He turned it beneath the lamp, studying the grain of the paper, the ink marks, the seal, and he realized that what sent a chill down his spine wasn't the fact that the letter was forged, but that it had been forged with such exact precision. Whoever created it knew exactly which line in the young woman's record would have disqualified her. Whoever created it knew what had to be written for that line to be overlooked. Whoever created it knew the order in which the personnel office in this house reviewed applications and where they tended to stop. And whoever created it hadn't embellished her, hadn't invented a beautiful past for her, but had acknowledged the stain directly and asked that people look beyond it. A method only someone who understood this house intimately would have dared to use. Someone had deliberately placed that young woman here. She hadn't slipped inside on her own. She had been brought in. And Rocco Barone, who for 15 years had never allowed a question to remain unanswered for more than 2 days, suddenly found himself facing one without even a single thread to follow. He considered summoning her, laying the letter on the desk, and asking her directly. He had done that hundreds of times with hundreds of people, and it had always worked, but he didn't. Because if she knew she had been exposed, then the person behind her would know too, and that person would withdraw, leaving the question inside his house forever. If he sent her out the door the following morning, he would be closing the only door that led to whoever had opened it. So he did the opposite of everything his instincts demanded. He kept her. That afternoon, he summoned a man to his office, a quiet man who handled this kind of work for him, and gave him very brief instructions. Follow her. Record where she goes, whom she meets, whom she calls, and where she stops on the way home. Don't let her know. Don't touch her. Don't report to anyone but me. The man nodded, accepted the envelope, and left. Rocco didn't tell Mrs. Whitlock. He didn't tell his mother either. He placed the letter inside a locked drawer, and during the 3 seconds before he closed it, a faint thought crossed his mind. That if the young woman truly belonged to someone, then the night before she had performed a role without an audience, in a pitch-dark room, before an elderly woman she believed was asleep. He shut the drawer, and he didn't know that 15 minutes after leaving his office with the envelope, the quiet man had pulled into a parking lot 3 blocks away and made a phone call to the person who truly paid him. Antonia Barone could have hidden that sweater very easily. She had a locked cabinet, a drawer whose key she alone carried, and 100 ways to make something so small disappear from the house without anyone knowing. She didn't. The following morning, she summoned Mrs. Whitlock, handed her the sweater folded into a neat square, and told the housekeeper to find out who it belonged to because she wanted it returned. She spoke in the most ordinary voice, the voice of an elderly woman asking for a minor favor, and Mrs. Whitlock carried the sweater away without realizing that she had just been assigned the precise task the other woman had planned since the night before. Antonia wanted to know one thing, and she could only learn it by dropping that sweater into the middle of the house and sitting quietly to see how far it sank. Mrs. Whitlock found the answer in less than an hour. 3 members of the staff immediately recognized the gray sweater faded at the elbows, and the 3rd remembered exactly who had walked back along the 1st-floor corridor the previous night, wearing only a thin shirt, while the entire west wing remained without power. By noon, the housekeeper stood at the door of the secondary kitchen, still holding the sweater, her face drained white, and called Marin inside. She closed the door. The first thing she did wasn't shout. She placed the sweater on the wooden table, pushed it toward Marin, and asked whether she knew whom she had touched. Marin looked at the sweater. She said nothing. Mrs. Whitlock continued, and her voice trembled, not with anger but with something else, something Marin recognized immediately because she had heard it in so many people over the past 2 years. She said the woman in that room was Mr. Barone's mother. She spoke the name, then fell silent as though she had dropped something fragile. Then she said that in this house, when a servant entered the lady of the house's room without permission, in the middle of the night, during a power failure, when no one was watching, people wouldn't ask what she had gone in there to do. They would ask what she had touched. She said that the year before, someone had been dismissed merely for carrying the wrong set of kitchen keys upstairs. She said she had worked there for 22 years, and had never once crossed that threshold without being summoned. Not once, even when she heard a sound from inside. And she spoke her final sentence in a voice that was almost pleading, asking whether Marin understood that she would now have to explain this to him. Marin remained still. She didn't argue even once. She didn't tell her about the bell ringing 3 times. She didn't tell her about the bent tubing, the wet blanket, or the locked linen cabinet. She didn't say that she had stood at the end of the hallway long enough to weigh everything before taking that first step. Nor did she say that if she could return to that night, she would do exactly the same thing again. Because she understood, more clearly than Mrs. Whitlock did, that no one in that kitchen was searching for the truth. The woman standing before her didn't want to know what had happened. She was simply afraid. And to someone who was afraid, every explanation became only one more thing for which they might be held responsible. So Marin asked only one question. She asked whether Mrs. Whitlock intended to dismiss her that very day. Mrs. Whitlock said she didn't know yet, that it depended on what was decided upstairs. Marin nodded. Then she made the only request she would make throughout that entire afternoon. She said that if they were going to dismiss her, would Mrs. Whitlock please speak on her behalf and ask them to let her complete the full 90 days. Mrs. Whitlock looked up, not understanding. Marin said she wasn't asking for additional pay, wasn't asking for a letter of recommendation, and wasn't asking to be allowed back. She was only asking for 90 days. The housekeeper asked why it had to be 90. Marin remained silent for a moment, then said that was the number of days written on the advertisement, and she said nothing more. Mrs. Whitlock studied her for a long time, and in that moment, something almost softened in the 60-year-old woman's face. Something that almost became a question. But then she picked up the sweater, folded it once more until it lay perfectly flat, and told Marin to return to work and not speak of this to anyone. This is something I can't help pointing out. Marin was about to be punished, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had shown kindness in the wrong place. That was the tragedy of poor people in a merciless world. That they were forced to learn by heart a brutally cruel lesson. That kindness was a dangerous luxury. That there were places in this world where reaching out a hand to another person was the most reckless act someone with nothing could ever commit. And the man who had built that world, the world in which a housekeeper of 22 years could turn pale over a sweater, was sitting on the floor directly below them, exactly 30 steps from the secondary kitchen. 3 days later, Gideon Voss arrived, and he brought his daughter with him. Voss was 58 years old, had served the Barone family since Rocco's father was still alive, and in this house he was the only person permitted to enter, without announcing himself first. The business discussion in the first-floor study was brief. Voss reported on 2 warehouses in Cranston, and an expense that had exceeded projections, which he had already handled on his own. Rocco listened, asked exactly one question about the date, then nodded. That was the end of it. While the 2 men spoke, Sabrina Voss waited in the small sitting room, where Mrs. Whitlock had just brought tea. She was 29, dressed with the careful polish of someone who knew she would be watched, and she carried a kind of courtesy practiced so thoroughly that it no longer resembled courtesy at all. She thanked Mrs. Whitlock, accepted the cup of tea, then gazed out the window and said very softly, almost as though speaking to herself, that the last time she had come, she had been late because of the snow. Mrs. Whitlock gave a polite murmur of acknowledgement, didn't ask when that last time had been, and thought nothing more of it, because people in this house were taught not to ask questions. The sentence fell onto the sitting-room floor and remained there for many months, unnoticed and forgotten, and by the time someone finally picked it up, everything had already changed beyond recognition. Sabrina set down her teacup. Then she asked a second question, and this time she didn't lower her voice at all. She asked whether the old woman still recognized anyone, or whether she had become completely confused. Mrs. Whitlock froze with the tray in her hands. The small sitting room stood directly beneath the open stairwell, and anyone who had lived in the house longer than a year knew that voices spoken there carried straight up to the second-floor corridor, every word clear. The housekeeper murmured something about the lady of the house still being well, then excused herself and went downstairs. Upstairs, behind the final door in the west corridor, Antonia Barone was sitting beside the window, and she had heard everything. She remained still for a while. Then she reached toward the drawer, took the key from the pocket of her robe, unlocked it, and placed the leather-bound notebook on her lap. She opened it. She picked up her pen. For a very long time, she held the tip about the width of one finger joint above the paper, long enough for the ink to dry at the nib. Then she set the pen down, closed the notebook, and returned it to its place. She wrote nothing. 18 months earlier, a sentence like that would have been enough to make her open the notebook and add another line, and she had written 11 such lines. But that afternoon she understood something that left her more weary than her illness ever had, that she no longer needed to test this young woman. She had known the answer before Sabrina ever sat down, and a notebook one no longer wished to write in was no different from a notebook already closed. Downstairs, when the business discussion had ended, Voss didn't rise to leave. He poured himself another drink, leaned back in his chair, and shifted into the familiar tone he used only when he was about to say something he had prepared in advance. He said he had stood beside this family for 30 years, that he had stood beside Rocco's father, and now stood beside Rocco, and that he was speaking as a man who regarded him as one of his own children. Then he spoke plainly. The two branches of the family had been divided for too long. Every dispute over the waterfront and the 3 northern transport routes came from the fact that neither side would yield to the other, and all of it could end in a single day if there were a wedding. He said his daughter had been properly educated, knew how to conduct herself, knew how to keep silent, and most importantly, understood how this house operated without needing anyone to teach her. He said the old woman upstairs didn't have much time left anyway, and what mother wouldn't want to see her son settled before she closed her eyes for the last time. Rocco listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt once, didn't change his expression, and didn't put down his glass. When Voss finished and sat waiting, Rocco still gave no answer. He only looked at him, long enough for the silence to become something heavier than a refusal, then rose and said he would have someone review the 2 warehouses in Cranston. Voss laughed, patted him on the shoulder, and told him to think about it, that there was no need to hurry. Father and daughter left at 4 o'clock. At 4:15, Dr. Halloran came down from upstairs and stopped at the foot of the staircase to wait for Rocco. He had examined Antonia for nearly an hour. He said her cardiac measurements had declined since the previous month, that the swelling had risen to her lower legs, and that her body was compensating by drawing strength away from other places, which wasn't a good sign. Then he said the words he had been weighing all the way down the stairs. He said it wasn't 6 months, as they had hoped. It might be 3. It happened on a Thursday morning, 11 days later, in the grand drawing room. Tessa Boyd was 19 years old and had started working there 2 months before Marin, and since the beginning of winter, she had begun taking slightly longer lunch breaks, rising a little more slowly, and avoiding tasks that required her to reach above her head. No one asked. In this house, people didn't ask. That morning, Tessa had been assigned to dust the shelves running along the south wall, and when she leaned across the middle section to reach the farthest corner, her knees gave way very slightly, only once, and her elbow struck the base. The white porcelain vase, painted with blue flowers, tilted, slid from the edge of the shelf, and fell onto the stone floor. The sound of it breaking wasn't loud. It was dry, brief, and clean, and for the next 3 seconds, the room was so silent that the pendulum clock in the hall could be heard. Mrs. Whitlock came running in from the corridor. She looked down at the floor, and the woman who had served in that house for 22 years raised both hands to her mouth. That vase was the only possession Antonia Barone had brought with her from Italy when she was 19, the only object in the entire house that hadn't been purchased with anyone's money, and every servant knew it because once a year the elderly woman cleaned it with her own hands and allowed no one else to touch it. Tessa stood rooted to the spot, her face drained white, both hands still clutching the dust cloth, and she didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't do anything at all. The kind of stillness that overtakes a person who has just understood that her life has turned in another direction within the space of 3 seconds. Marin entered at that exact moment, carrying a tray of clean towels up from downstairs. She stopped at the threshold. She looked at the pieces of porcelain scattered across the floor, then looked at Tessa. She looked at the young woman for exactly 1 second. In that second, she saw the 2 hands clenched around the cloth, saw the slight curve beneath the uniform that she had noticed 3 weeks earlier and had never mentioned to anyone, and saw the eyes of a 19-year-old staring down at the floor as though she were staring into a pit. Then Marin set the tray of towels on the table and spoke. She said, "I did it, Mrs." Whitlock spun around. She asked what Marin had said. Marin repeated herself more clearly, saying that she had knocked over the vase. Tessa opened her mouth as though she meant to say something, and Marin looked at her once, only once, and the girl fell silent. "Mrs." Whitlock stood between them, her eyes moving from one woman to the other, and she understood perfectly well what had just happened, but she said nothing. She merely told Tessa to go down to the kitchen, then went to summon someone. Rocco came down about 10 minutes later. He didn't look at anyone when he entered. He walked directly to the broken pieces, stood over them for a moment, then crouched and picked up the largest fragment. He turned it in his hand and examined the inner surface beneath the glaze. He placed it back where it had been. Then he stood and said, in the flat, even voice the entire household feared more than any shout, that the vase was worth $42,000. The number remained suspended in the drawing room for a moment. "Mrs." Whitlock took half a step forward, intending to speak. Rocco raised one hand without looking at her and said to let the woman answer. He turned toward Marin. He asked whether she had broken it. Marin stood straight, her arms resting at her sides, and said yes. Rocco showed no reaction. He waited about 3 seconds, then asked again, more slowly this time, separating every word, whether she had broken this vase. And for the second time, she gave the same single word, yes. No one in the room dared breathe deeply. Mrs. Whitlock lowered her eyes to the floor. At the kitchen doorway, Tessa Boyd stood hidden behind the wooden frame, both hands wrapped around her stomach, looking at the woman in the center of the room with an expression she would carry for the rest of her life. Rocco Barone watched Marin Hollis for a long time. He was the man who had read her file twice, who knew her home address, who knew the exact amount of her debt down to the last digit, who had kept someone following her every afternoon for the past 2 weeks, and read a report each evening describing everything she had done. He knew she didn't have $42,000. He knew she didn't even have $400. He also knew, down to the exact second, that when the vase struck the floor, she had been in the basement collecting towels, because nothing happened in this house without his knowing it. And still she stood before him and said yes, twice. He had spent 15 years learning how to read people, and he had become very good at it. So good that he could watch a man lie and know whom the man was protecting, and how much money was involved. But the woman standing before him now was telling a lie that made no sense at all. She gained nothing from it. She wasn't protecting anyone powerful. She was placing her own neck beneath the blade for a 19-year-old girl with whom, according to every report he had received, she had never exchanged more than 5 sentences. And in that moment, for the first time in many years, Rocco Barone found himself standing before a human being he couldn't read. He stepped 1 pace closer, then he asked, "What do you intend to pay with?" Marin didn't answer at once. She asked permission to go upstairs, and Mrs. Whitlock started to stop her. But Rocco gave a single nod, so no one said anything more. They heard her footsteps climbing the back stairs, heard the door to the servants' room open and close, then silence for about a minute, then footsteps descending again. When she returned to the grand drawing room, she carried something so small that at first no one could tell what it was. She walked to the table and placed it on the wooden surface beside the broken pieces of white porcelain painted with blue flowers, which no one had yet cleared away. It was a wooden box about the length of a hand, with one corner chipped away, most of the paint worn from its edges, and brass hinges tarnished almost black. It rested there on a table inside a house where every candlestick cost more than a full month of her wages, and it looked exactly like what it was, an old object worth almost nothing. Marin rested her hand on the lid for a moment, then drew it away. She said she knew it wasn't worth $42,000. She said it wasn't worth $40. Then she spoke a third sentence, and her voice changed slightly when she reached it. Only slightly, but in a room that's silent, everyone heard. She said, "But it's the only thing I have left of my mother." Rocco said nothing. Mrs. Whitlock stood motionless at the far end of the room. Marin turned the box around, found the small knob on the back, and wound it. The old gears scraped beneath her fingers, 3 turns. Then she stopped and opened the lid. 7 notes rang out. They drifted through the grand drawing room of that gray stone mansion, between walls hung with oil paintings and chairs upholstered in velvet. 7 fragile notes from a melody anyone raised in that region had heard before, slow and slightly out of tune on the 4th note because one tooth of the metal comb had broken. Then, at the 8th note, the mechanism jammed. There was a very soft click, and silence. No one in the room moved. Marin closed the lid, pushed the box about the length of a hand across the table toward Rocco, and spoke the rest very quickly, as though if she slowed down, she wouldn't be able to finish. She said that if he kept it, he could deduct money from her wages every month until the debt was paid, no matter how many years it took, and he could take whatever amount he chose. She said she wasn't asking him to reduce it. She said she would work extra night shifts if necessary. Then she spoke her final sentence, looking directly into the face of the man no one in the entire city dared to look at directly. She said, "Please don't dismiss anyone." From the hallway doorway came the sound of something falling. No one had noticed that for the past several minutes, there had been one more person in the room. Antonia Barone had come down when she heard the vase break, and had been sitting in her wheelchair at the threshold, hidden behind the partly open wooden door, and she had heard everything. From the figure of $42,000 to those 7 notes. She was the woman who had created 18 months of tests inside this house. She was the woman who had sat in darkness and pretended to be confused 11 times, maintaining the role until the final moment without breaking it once. But those 7 notes had accomplished what the other 11 people never had. Antonia placed both hands on the armrests and stood. She rose upright from the wheelchair, a woman 71 years old, whose doctor had just said she might have only 3 months left, and she spoke more loudly than she had spoken in the past 2 years. She said, "Enough." She said, "Stop this." Then her knees gave way. The entire room moved at once. But the first person to reach her wasn't her son or the housekeeper who had served her for 22 years. It was the young woman standing beside the table with the wooden box. Marin abandoned everything and rushed forward, dropped to her knees, slipped one arm behind the elderly woman's back and the other beneath her elbow, and lowered her slowly to the floor instead of trying to hold her upright, exactly as students were taught during their first year of nursing school. She loosened Antonia's collar. She placed 2 fingers against her wrist and looked up at the clock on the wall. She told Mrs. Whitlock to bring a pillow and raise her feet. She gave several brief, precise instructions without a trace of panic, and everyone in the room obeyed her, without realizing that the person giving orders in that house was a maid who had just confessed to breaking a valuable possession. Rocco knelt on the other side of his mother. He looked at the 2 hands checking her pulse, then raised his eyes to Marin's face, and there was no trace left in her expression of the woman who had just stood with her head lowered and accepted a debt of $42,000. I consider this the most meaningful moment in the entire story, because Marin didn't give away something she had in abundance. She gave away something irreplaceable, something that, once lost, no amount of money in the world could ever buy back. There is a vast distance between giving from what remains and giving from what is already missing. Wealthy people still donate, but they rarely feel pain. She did, and that pain was the truest measure of her generosity. The ambulance took Antonia Barone away shortly before noon that day, and she remained in the hospital for 3 days. Dr. Halloran told Rocco in the 4th-floor corridor that she had survived this time, but then he added something without lowering his voice at all, that her heart muscle had weakened to the point where one more episode like this might mean she would never wake again. He said she needed someone beside her, not merely every day but every hour, and he said that person had to know how to measure, how to count, how to recognize the warning signs before they became a crisis, not someone who only knew how to carry a tray of medicine upstairs. Rocco stood listening with his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he said nothing. During those 3 days, there was one detail Mrs. Whitlock would recount years later, that every evening after her shift ended, the maid named Marin took 2 buses to the hospital, sat on a bench outside the room for about half an hour, never asked to be let inside, never asked anyone a single question, only looked through the glass panel in the door, and then went home. Mrs. Whitlock knew because she went to the hospital on the 2nd night as well, and she saw Marin sitting there. The 2 women said nothing to each other. On the day Antonia returned home, she summoned both Mrs. Whitlock and Rocco to her room. She sat in the chair beside the window, thinner than she had been 3 days earlier, but her voice was clear in every word. She said she wanted to rearrange one matter in the household. She said that from that day forward, Marin Hollis would no longer work as a maid, but would become her private caregiver, living in the house, remaining on duty through the night, with her wages paid from Antonia's personal account. Mrs. Whitlock objected immediately, and she spoke aloud the thing everyone in the house had known for weeks but no one had dared to say. She said Marin's nursing license was suspended, ma'am, that it was written in her file, and that she wasn't permitted to perform that kind of work anywhere in the state. Antonia looked at the housekeeper who had served her for 22 years. Then she answered with a sentence Mrs. Whitlock would repeat many times over the years that followed. She said, "I don't need her papers. I need her hands." Rocco stood by the window throughout the conversation, with his back turned, and when everything had been settled, he spoke only one sentence. He said, "It's your decision, Mother." That afternoon, when only the 2 women remained in the room, Antonia told Marin to take the key from the pocket of her robe and unlock the bottom drawer. Marin brought the leather-bound notebook to her and placed it on her lap, and Antonia opened it, then turned it around for Marin to see. There were 11 lines on the page. Each line contained a name, a date, and a number indicating minutes. All 11 lines had been crossed through. Antonia offered no explanation. She simply let her read. Marin read from the top to the bottom, slowly. And when she reached the final line, she straightened. She wasn't angry. Her voice was quieter than usual, and that was precisely why it hurt the elderly woman more than a shout ever could. She said, "So I was only number 12. Antonia looked up sharply. She said, "No, child." Then she stopped. She opened her mouth to continue. And in that moment she almost told her everything. Almost spoke the truth she had kept locked inside her chest for 2 years. But then she closed her lips again. People might later blame her for that silence. But perhaps she believed she still had 3 months. And 3 months seemed long enough to tell a long story. And that was where she was wrong. Wrong in the way most of us are wrong, when we believe we still have time. Antonia only said, "You're mistaken." And she said nothing more. Marin closed the notebook, placed it on the table, and stood there for a while. Then she said something that left the 71-year-old woman utterly still. She said, "Ma'am, you didn't call me by the wrong name." Antonia didn't move. Marin continued, her voice still soft, still without accusation. She said the name Antonia had spoken that night wasn't hers, and she had known that the moment she heard it. She said she had spent 4 years working on a medical ward, and had often heard people call out names while drifting in and out of consciousness, and people only called the names of those they remembered most deeply. She said she had looked at the fallen photograph on the table that night, and there had been 3 people in it, not 2. She said she knew it was the name of Antonia's daughter. Antonia raised one hand to her chest. She couldn't speak, because what she had just heard overturned the entire meaning of the last 18 months of her life. The 11 people before Marin had sat in that room with an elderly woman they believed was confused, and every one of them had left before the 4th minute. But this young woman had understood from the very first moment that the hand holding hers belonged to someone who wasn't confused at all, that Antonia knew exactly whose name she was calling, that it was the cry of a mother longing for a daughter who was no longer there. Marin had understood everything. She could have pulled her hand away, risen, walked out, and protected her job. And still she had remained. She had stayed for those full 4 minutes on the cold stone floor in the darkness, holding the hand of a woman who wasn't her mother, so a stranger could rest in the certainty that someone was there. He stopped her in the 2nd-floor corridor late one evening that weekend, just as she came out of his mother's room carrying a tray of used dishes. He was leaning against the wall near the bend in the hallway, and Marin knew at once that he had been waiting there, not merely passing by. She stopped and lowered her head slightly, as she had been taught during her first 9 days. Rocco didn't waste time. He asked why she kept taking the blame for other people. Marin looked up. She asked whether he meant the vase. He said no. He meant St. Brendan. He said he had read her file, and there was a line in it about missing medication, termination of employment, suspension of her license, and no prosecution. He said the line had been written exactly the way people wrote such things when they didn't believe she had done it, but didn't care enough to investigate further. Then he spoke his final sentence, and it didn't sound like a question so much as a heavy object being set down between them. He said, "I'm not investigating someone else. I'm asking you." Marin stood still for a while. She could have remained silent, as she had that day in the secondary kitchen, and silence was the instinct that had kept her alive for the past 2 years. But that night, she placed the tray of dishes on the edge of a hallway table and told him. She said that year she had been working the night shift on the medical ward, and there was a 23-year-old man working in the pharmacy department, the son of a department chief at the hospital, who had taken medication 3 times over the course of 4 months. She said she had known after the 2nd time. She said she had confronted him, and he had cried in the supply room, talking about his mother, about being expelled from medical school, about facing criminal charges, and never being allowed to work in healthcare anywhere again. She said she had told him to enter treatment, and he had promised that he would. Then the 3rd time happened. The inventory count exposed the loss, and an internal investigation was opened. She said they summoned her to a conference room, where 3 people were waiting, and one of them was the young man's father. She said they didn't force her. They merely presented the matter very gently, saying that if it became a criminal case, both of them would be ruined. But if one person accepted responsibility for negligence in managing the medication cabinet, everything would remain an internal matter. They promised she would be allowed to keep her internship placement and complete her final year, that her case would be reviewed after 6 months, and that someone would write to the state board on her behalf. She said she believed them. She said she had been 25 years old, and she had believed 3 men in white coats, sitting inside a room with glass doors. Rocco asked what happened next. Marin said the report was written differently from what they had agreed. She said the charge of negligent medication management in the official report became missing prescription drugs in her expanded background record. She said her internship was canceled 3 weeks later because of what they called a staff reorganization. She said the letter to the state board was never written, and when she called 6 months later, she was told that the young man's father had moved to another hospital in the neighboring state. She lost the degree she had spent 3.5 years pursuing. She lost 4 years of experience. She also lost the ability to earn a living in the very profession whose studies she had interrupted so she could return home and care for her mother. Rocco asked why she hadn't sued them. Marin asked with what. She said the 3 of them had the hospital's lawyers, while she had $40,000 in debt from her own mother's medical bills. He was silent. Then he asked his original question again, more slowly. He asked why. Not why she had agreed, but why she had been the person sitting in that room at all. Marin thought for a moment, then said she didn't take the blame for other people. She said, "I just never learned how to stand by and watch." She said it wasn't a virtue, that it was more like a defect, and it had taken almost everything from her. Then she told him the part he hadn't asked about. She told him about the night her mother died, in a room at the end of the oncology corridor in that same hospital. She said that night her mother had given her a small wooden box, the same box Marin had placed on the table in the grand drawing room of this house only a few days earlier, and her mother had told her that it only played half the song, that she had never managed to repair it. But once Marin heard the beginning, she already knew how the rest went, didn't she? She said her mother had then taken her hand, and the final thing she asked of her wasn't to live a good life, and it wasn't to take care of her brother. It was something else. Don't let yourself become bitter, sweetheart. When Marin finished, she picked up the tray of dishes. She asked to be excused, then walked down the back staircase. Rocco Barone remained alone in the dark corridor. For 15 years, whenever someone told him the story of their life, he had always done the same thing. He sat quietly, listened, and searched for the softest place in it, the place that might be useful later. He had become so skilled at it that it was no longer a choice but a reflex, as natural as breathing. That night, for the first time in 15 years, he listened to an entire story from beginning to end without searching for the weakness in the person telling it. And what kept him standing in that corridor for so long wasn't the story itself. It was the realization that he had forgotten to look. The broken porcelain pieces were wrapped in tissue paper and placed inside a cardboard box. And the following week, Rocco summoned an appraiser, not because he still cared about compensation, but because the insurance policy covering the objects in the house required a formal valuation report for any loss exceeding $10,000. It was a procedure he had signed off on dozens of times during the past 15 years. The appraiser was an elderly man with a magnifying loupe from a firm in Boston, and he spent nearly 2 hours in the first-floor study, with the porcelain fragments spread across a black velvet cloth. When he finally looked up, he wore the hesitant expression of a man about to say something the owner of the house wouldn't want to hear. He said it wasn't Meissen. He said the glaze was right, the shape was right, and the hand-painted pattern had been executed with great skill. But the mark beneath the base had been stamped rather than painted, and the porcelain body was too white for the period claimed. He said it was a European reproduction, made sometime around the 1960s, of good quality, with a market value of approximately $300. Rocco asked whether he was certain. The old man said he had been doing this work for 37 years, and he was certain. Then he added a sentence without knowing what he had just opened. He said that if the owner wished, his firm kept transaction records for most objects with known origins in that region, and if the original had ever passed through an auction house, there would be documentation. 3 days later, the file was on Rocco's desk. The original vase had been sold through an auction house in Newport 11 years earlier, but it wasn't the only object. During that same year, under the authority of the same person's signature, 19 items had left this house. The Victorian silver set from the dining room cabinet, which he had always assumed had been put away because his mother no longer liked displaying it. 3 paintings from the second-floor corridor, which he had believed had been sent away for restoration before she changed her mind and hung different ones. His maternal grandfather's collection of pocket watches, every one of them had been sold within 7 months of that year, and every one had been replaced with a commissioned reproduction paid for from Antonia Barone's personal account. He sat for a very long time with the papers before him. Then he called the elderly accountant, who had served the family since his father's time, and he asked him directly, The man remained silent long enough for Rocco to understand that he had been waiting 11 years for that question. He said the lady had ordered him not to tell. Then he told him. That year, 6 months after Rocco's father died, the Northern Branch had presented a compensation claim involving the 3 transport routes and the waterfront, a sum no one believed they truly intended to collect, but rather a test to discover where the 19-year-old boy who had just taken that seat would break. Rocco remembered it. He remembered 3 months stretched tight as wire, remembered meetings in which he sat without understanding half of what was being said, and remembered the night when he believed everything was about to collapse. Then, without warning, the Northern Branch withdrew its demand. People told him they had been afraid, that they respected the Barone name, that he had handled the matter correctly. He had believed that for 11 years. He had built the entire man he later became upon that belief, that he had stood on his own at 19, that he owed nothing to anyone, that no one in this world ever gave him anything without demanding repayment. The truth was that on the night before the Northern Branch withdrew, his mother had sat alone in the small drawing room with 2 of their representatives, without a lawyer, and paid the entire amount with the money from selling. One by one, the possessions inside the house her father had bought for her when she was 19. She kept only one thing, and refused to sell it, her wedding ring. The accountant said she had given him only one instruction, that if her son ever asked, he was to tell him the truth, but he must never be the one to speak first. That evening, Rocco went up to his mother's room as he did every night. She was sitting by the window, and Marin had just finished measuring her blood pressure and was recording it on the monitoring sheet. He paused at the threshold for 3 seconds, as he had done out of habit for 15 years, then entered. He said nothing about the vase. He said nothing about the 19 objects, the auction house in Newport, or the night the Northern Branch withdrew. He only asked how she was feeling that day. But he didn't address her with the empty, distant form he had used for so many years. The unfinished speech of a man who had forgotten how to speak to his own mother. He called her mother. Antonia was holding a cup of tea. She didn't turn around at once. She remained still for a single beat, then placed the cup very gently onto its saucer, and when she looked toward him, she said only that she felt better today. Marin, standing at the table with the sheet of paper in her hand, looked up at them, then lowered her eyes and continued writing, and she didn't understand why the room had suddenly changed. There are debts people spend their entire lives repaying without ever knowing they owe them. Antonia hadn't told him, not because she had forgotten, but because she understood something very simple, that once spoken aloud, it became a favor, while in silence, it remained love. And the tragedy was that her son had lived for 11 full years, believing no one had ever given him anything without asking for repayment, while the person who had given him the most was still sitting upstairs, waiting for him to come to her every night. Gideon Voss made his move on a Monday morning, and he did it in the manner of a man who, for 30 years, had never needed to fight for anything inside this house. He didn't come empty-handed. He placed a thick file on Rocco's desk, neatly bound and numbered page by page, then sat in the chair opposite him, wearing the expression of a man performing the most painful duty of his life. The file contained everything. It contained Marin Hollis's movements over 7 consecutive weeks, recorded by the hour. It contained photographs taken from a distance of her speaking to a man outside a laundromat on the south side of the city, with a note stating that the man had relatives connected to the Northern Branch. It contained a copy of the recommendation letter signed by a doctor who didn't exist, along with a notation claiming that someone had deliberately planted her in the house. It contained a list of every time she had gone to the 2nd floor, every night she had remained on duty, and every occasion when she had been left alone with the elderly woman. Voss said it pained him to speak of it, that he had placed her under surveillance for 2 months because of professional instinct, that the old woman upstairs was being approached according to a carefully arranged plan, and that if Rocco didn't believe him, he should read the entire file before saying anything. Rocco read it. He read from the first page to the last without skipping a single line, and it took him nearly 40 minutes while Voss sat silently across from him. What Voss didn't know was that the man holding the file recognized every line written inside it. He recognized them because he was the one who had ordered those reports. He understood now whom the quiet man who had carried the envelope out of his office 2 months earlier had truly been reporting to. And he noticed something else, something Voss had never anticipated, that after 2 months of following a young woman home from work, his men had recorded a great many things but had failed to record the one thing that mattered, where she stopped every Tuesday and Friday evening, and why. In the entire thick file, there wasn't a single line about her family. There wasn't another name anywhere except hers. Gideon Voss had spent 2 months watching her and still didn't know that the woman he intended to use as a pawn had a 9-year-old brother waiting for surgery in the spring. During that same week, Marin received a call from an unfamiliar number while standing at a bus stop. The man on the other end introduced himself with great courtesy and said that the collection company holding her $40,000 debt had transferred it to a new owner, and that he was that owner. He didn't threaten her. He didn't say a single word that could be recorded and used in a lawsuit. He merely said that he understood her circumstances, that he was a reasonable man, and that she should leave her job before the end of the week. Then he wished her a pleasant day and ended the call. Marin remained at the bus stop for a long time afterward. She told no one. Rocco stood before 2 things. On one side were 7 weeks of surveillance, photographs, diagrams, and the forged letter, all arranged neatly inside a file that anyone would have believed. On the other was a dark second-floor corridor, a tray of dishes set down on the edge of a table, and a woman telling him the story of her life, without knowing that he already had her records locked inside a drawer, recounting every detail exactly as it had happened, concealing nothing that made her look better and softening nothing that made her look worse, including the one part no person inventing a story would ever have been foolish enough to mention. He chose the second. The meeting took place on Thursday in the formal dining room, with 7 people present. Rocco didn't say a single word about Marin. He began with the 2 warehouses in Cranston, then produced a comparison of incoming shipment volumes and payments made over 14 months, followed by 3 transport contracts signed with a company whose true owner was the brother-in-law of a member of the Northern Branch. He spoke slowly and evenly, never raising his voice once, and he spoke for exactly 12 minutes. When he finished, no one in the room looked at Voss anymore. Gideon Voss sprang from his chair. He managed half a sentence. The 2 men seated nearest the door rose at the same time, and one of them placed a hand on the back of Voss's chair. Nothing happened. Voss remained standing there for several more seconds, looking around the table, studying each face in turn, and he understood what everyone else had understood before him. Then he picked up his coat and walked out. The door of the formal dining room closed behind him. From that day forward, no one in Providence ever heard the name Gideon Voss spoken again. The following evening, Rocco summoned Marin to his study. He pushed a document bearing a red seal across the desk toward her. She picked it up and read it, then read it again before raising her eyes. He said the debt no longer existed, that it had been paid in full and the account closed, and that she would receive written confirmation within 10 days. Marin placed the document on the desk. Her hand trembled slightly. She asked why. Rocco looked at her for a moment before answering, and he told her the truth. The naked truth that a man like him almost never allowed himself to speak. He said, "Because I wanted to know whether you would stay or leave when there was nothing left to keep you here." Marin didn't answer immediately. She stood there, and both of them understood that the question he had just asked wasn't about a piece of paper. Then she said it was time for the elderly woman's medicine, and asked to be excused so she could go upstairs. The following morning, she was still there at 6:15, and the morning after that, she was there again. Antonia Barone lived for another 5 months rather than 3, and when Dr. Halloran signed the death certificate, he told Rocco that sometimes people stayed longer than expected because they had a reason to remain. She passed away one night in early June, in her sleep, seated in the same chair beside the window. The evening before, Marin had asked for time off to take her younger brother to a follow-up appointment after his spring surgery, and the elderly woman herself had told her to go, that she could take the entire evening if she wished. At nearly 9 o'clock, Marin called the house to ask whether Antonia had taken her medicine, and the 2 of them spoke for 4 or 5 minutes about nothing of consequence, about the boy no longer needing one of his crutches, about the weather turning warm, about what Antonia wanted to eat the following day. Then, before ending the call, Antonia said something Marin didn't understand at the time. She said, "Thank you for coming back." Marin thought she meant that she would return to work the next evening. She said, "Yes, ma'am. Sleep well." Those were the final words they ever spoke to each other. The following morning, Mrs. Whitlock went upstairs with the tea tray and found the elderly woman still seated in the chair, her head tilted slightly to one side, her face perfectly peaceful, and in the palm of her hand was the small wooden box with one chipped corner. No one knew when she had taken it from the drawer in the study downstairs, and no one knew how long she had sat there holding it. The funeral was held on Saturday. 4 days later, when everything had grown quiet, Rocco went upstairs to clear his mother's room. He wouldn't allow anyone else to do it. He opened the wardrobe, opened each drawer, arranged every object, and moved very slowly, with the slowness of a man who didn't truly want the task to end. In the bottom drawer, beneath the leather-bound notebook, there was an unsealed paper envelope. He opened it. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first was a handwritten draft of a letter of recommendation, heavily crossed out, with 3 different attempts at the opening sentence, and he recognized the handwriting from the very first word because it was the same hand that had written in his school record book throughout all 12 years of his education. At the bottom of the page, where the signature belonged, his mother had tried 3 different names before circling one. Robert Ainsley. The second sheet was only a small piece of paper torn from a notebook, written in haste, with the ink slightly blurred in one corner. It said that the night nurse, on February 14th, had sat with her throughout the night, without speaking, that a music box had fallen from the nurse's pocket, played 7 notes, then jammed, that she hadn't had time to ask her name, and that they must find her. Rocco sat down on the edge of his mother's bed, with the 2 papers in his hands. It took him a long time to fit everything together, and when he finally did, he had to place the papers beside him because his hands could no longer hold them. 2 years earlier, on a night in the middle of February, Antonia Barone suffered her first heart attack and was taken to St. Brendan shortly before midnight. He remembered that night. He had been in Hartford, a 3-hour drive away, and he had arrived the following morning. He had always told himself that it was the fastest he could possibly have come. He had never asked who stayed with his mother during those 8 hours. Throughout those 8 hours, not a single member of this family came. Not one relative. Not one of the 7 people who still gathered for meetings in the formal dining room. No one at all. There had been only a night nurse who, according to procedure, needed to check on her once every 15 minutes, yet had pulled a chair beside the bed of a frightened elderly woman and remained there until morning. She said nothing. She didn't ask who Antonia was, didn't ask whether she belonged to the Barone family, and perhaps she didn't even know what that name meant. Near dawn, when she bent down to adjust the blanket, a small object fell from the pocket of her white coat onto the floor and opened, playing 7 notes before it caught and stopped. Antonia had heard those 7 notes in a hospital room at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she had remembered them for 2 years. She hadn't had time to ask the nurse's name because the shift changed at 7, and she had searched for her. She searched for 11 months. She didn't dare ask anyone in the house for help, because the moment she asked even one person, her son would know within a day. And she understood very well what would happen to that young woman if Rocco learned about her before Antonia had time to discover what kind of person she truly was. So a 71-year-old woman with heart failure did everything herself. She called the hospital and was told that the employee had left. She called the old telephone number and found it disconnected. She sent someone with a letter to the former address, and it came back because the occupant had moved away. For 11 months, piece by piece, she continued until she uncovered a name, a suspended license, and a line of accusation in an expanded background record that she knew perfectly well would prevent the young woman from ever being accepted into this house. So she sat down at a table, wrote a letter of recommendation, and signed the name of a man who had never existed. Then she waited. In the afternoon, when she ordered the small drawing room prepared, the flowers replaced, and tea served for 2, the final test of those 18 months had never been intended for Marin Hollis. It had been arranged for someone else, someone who failed to arrive because of the snow, someone who, a few days later, sat in that very drawing room and carelessly spoke a sentence no one noticed. The young woman who opened the door that night hadn't been candidate number 12. She was the person Antonia had spent 11 months trying to find, and Antonia hadn't even realized yet that she had found her. On the final line of the note, beneath the words "find her," his mother had added one more sentence in much smaller handwriting, as though she had written it only for herself. No one deserves to be left alone in the dark. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the middle of June, in the grand drawing room itself, and additional chairs were brought in because more than 24 people attended. Attorney Emmett Sharp opened his briefcase, read the introductory statement, then read the first provision, under which nearly all of Antonia Barone's personal assets, including 3 accounts, 2 rental properties in Cranston, and the remaining money in her retirement fund, were transferred into a foundation bearing her name, established to help cover medical expenses for single-parent families in South Providence. A murmur moved through the room, but no one rose. Then Mr. Sharp read the second provision. The gray stone house on the east side, together with every remaining object inside it, was left to Marin Hollis. The murmuring stopped completely. Marin was seated in the final row near the door, because she had come as an employee, not as an heir, and she was the most bewildered person in the room. "Mr. Sharp," said Mrs. Barone had left a letter with instructions that it be read aloud. He opened it and began. "The letter said that I haven't lost my mind. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know exactly what everyone will say. It said that I am repaying a debt, and that debt is 2 years old. It said that one night in the middle of February 2 years ago, I lay in a hospital room, and I was afraid in the way a 70-year-old woman doesn't wish to admit to anyone, and during those 8 hours, not one person bearing this family's name crossed the doorway. It said that a young woman stayed. She didn't know who I was, didn't ask who I was, and didn't say a single word to me, and that was how I knew she wanted nothing from me. It said that it took me 11 months to find her again, and I found her, and I remained silent for too long because I kept believing I still had time." The letter ended with one brief sentence, that this house belongs to me. My father bought it for me, and I have the right to leave it to the person who gave me what this entire family never did. Mr. Sharp folded the letter. The person who stood wasn't any of the men seated in the first 3 rows. None of them moved, because every one of them knew perfectly well who was sitting at the front of the room. The person who rose was a 68-year-old woman in a gray coat, seated in the second row on the left, the deceased woman's younger sister, Delphine Rusk. She didn't shout. She didn't point at anyone. She merely opened the handbag resting on her lap, removed a stack of papers, handed it to the attorney seated beside her, and said in a very calm voice that she had filed a petition with the county civil court the previous Friday. Her attorney stood and presented the matter briefly and precisely. First, there was a will executed in 2019, legally valid and fully notarized, in which the deceased herself had left the entire house to his client. Second, the new will had been amended while the testator was suffering from a terminal illness, and the beneficiary was the very person who cared for her every day, lived in the house, remained on duty through the night, and was the only person who spent long hours alone with her, without any other witness present. Third, he placed a set of certified hospital records on the table, bearing the exact wording of the accusation involving missing prescription medication and the decision suspending the beneficiary's nursing license. He said his client wasn't accusing anyone of fraud. He said his client was merely asking the court to determine whether the final will had been made free from undue influence. And he said that with circumstances such as these, any judge would find reason to examine the matter. Then he sat down. In that grand drawing room were 7 men who had once been able to silence an entire waterfront merely by entering it, and not one of them could do anything. That afternoon, Mr. Sharp remained with Rocco in the first-floor study and spoke plainly because he had worked for the family for 20 years and knew he was paid to speak plainly. He said this was civil court, not a negotiation at the docks. He said there was no one to call, no one to invite to dinner, no payment to make. He said the opposing side didn't need to prove that Marin had done anything wrong. They only needed to make the court see that the circumstances were suspicious, and the circumstances truly were suspicious. He said the only thing that could save the case was the truth, and he emphasized what followed, that the truth had to be proved, had to have documents, had to have witnesses, had to have something capable of standing before a judge who had never met anyone in that room. Rocco asked what they had. Mr. Sharp said a handwritten note and a letter signed with the name of a man who didn't exist weren't enough and might even work against them. I kept thinking about the woman seated in the second row on the left. She was greedy, yes, but that day she was also witnessing something more painful than losing a house. Proof that the sister beside whom she had lived for 68 years had never lost the ability to love another human being. She simply hadn't given that love to her. Sometimes the deepest anger in a person doesn't come from losing anything at all, but from the moment they understand that they were never chosen. The person who walked into attorney Emmett Sharp's office on a Thursday morning in late June was Sabrina Voss, and she came alone, without an appointment, carrying a thin file folder. Mr. Sharp had been about to ask his secretary to show her out, but she placed the folder on his desk and opened it before he could speak. Inside was a sworn affidavit, signed by a notary and clearly dated, from a 31-year-old man who was now working as a pharmacist in another state, the son of a former department chief at St. Brendan Hospital. In that affidavit, the man admitted everything, from the first time he took the medication to the meeting in the room with the glass doors. And he stated clearly that the promise to preserve the internship position of the person who had accepted the blame for him had never been honored. Mr. Sharp read it twice, then looked up and asked how she had obtained it. Sabrina said that she and the man had attended the same school, that she had known about the matter for many years, and that in the past 7 years, this was the first time anyone had asked. Mr. Sharp asked what she wanted. She said she wanted her name to appear in the case record as the person who had provided the evidence, publicly and officially entered into the court transcript. He understood at once. Her father had disappeared from the city, but the name Voss still clung to her like an ink stain, and she was trying to rewrite the first line of her own record. That afternoon, when Marin was called in to sign the papers, the two women met in the hallway. Sabrina didn't waste time. She said, "I'm not helping you." She said, "I'm saving myself." Then she spoke her final sentence without the slightest softness, but those two things happened to be the same. The court handled the rest. In response to the court's order, St. Brendan Hospital submitted the medical ward duty roster for the night of February 14th, 2 years earlier, and Marin Hollis's name appeared on it, assigned to the shift from 10 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning. Along with it came the medical record of a 71-year-old female patient admitted that night. And at the bottom of every vital signs chart, once each hour, was the abbreviated signature of the nurse on duty. 7 signatures, from 11 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Nothing inside the gray stone house could prove what those 7 signatures proved, that the two women had met 2 years before one of them ever entered the other's home as an employee. Delphine Rusk withdrew her petition before the trial date. 3 months later, the State Board of Nursing reopened the case, and with the sworn affidavit in hand, they restored Marin Hollis's nursing license. Not a single dollar was spent to make it happen. The case was saved by the truth, and at last, the truth could be proven. On the evening Marin received her license again, Rocco gave her a wooden box. It had been restored by a craftsman in Boston. The chipped corner repaired with the same kind of wood, the brass hinges cleaned, and the broken tooth of the music comb replaced. Marin set it on the table, turned it around, and wound it. Shenandoah began at the first note, passed through the place where the 4th note had once sounded wrong, passed through the place where the 8th note had once caught, and continued all the way to the end. No one spoke while it played. When the music stopped, she noticed a sheet of paper folded into quarters and tucked beneath the inside of the lid. It was a receipt for the sale of a set of wedding jewelry, dated exactly 4 months before Antonia Barone died, and clipped beside it was a small handwritten note. "Let the boy run." 5 years later, the largest gray stone house on the east side was no longer a mansion. It bore the name Antonia Barone Community Clinic, providing free examinations and medication to single-parent families in South Providence, and it was run by a 32-year-old nurse. Tessa Boyd worked as the receptionist at the front desk, and her daughter had started 1st grade. It took Rocco Barone 5 full years to move everything bearing his family's name into the lawful world, one company at a time, one contract at a time, and everyone who witnessed the process said it was far harder than outsiders could ever imagine, that there were nights when he sat alone in his study until morning, and that not everyone in his position could have done it. Inside the glass cabinet in the center of the waiting room were 2 objects. One was a repaired wooden music box, and beside it was an old brass nurse call bell darkened with age. One afternoon in early summer, 14-year-old Wesley Hollis ran across the sunlit courtyard, laughing as he called for his sister from the gate, both feet crunching over the gravel. He stopped before the glass cabinet with a child who had come for a first examination, opened the glass cover, and wound the music box so the child could hear it. The child asked who the box belonged to. Wesley said it belonged to his sister, then turned and asked her a question he had asked many times, and still loved hearing answered. "Why did you give this box to them back then?" Marin said, "Because at the time, it was everything I had." I won't end with a lesson. I'll leave you only with the image of a boy running across a sunlit courtyard and an old music box that can now play the entire song. No one in this story became wealthy because they were kind. They simply no longer had to sit alone in the dark. And I think that is what we spend our whole lives searching for. Engraved on the small brass plaque inside the glass cabinet was a single line: "No one deserves to be left alone in the dark." In memory of Antonia Barone, if this story has left something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it, so that each day you can discover more stories worth hearing. We would truly love to know how you felt about today's story, so please leave a comment and tell us what you felt deep within your heart, because every word you write will be heard. May you and your family always enjoy good health, joyful days, and peaceful lives. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.